Hi, and welcome to the Changing Perspectives podcast, the show where we discuss a variety of topics including grief, parenting, health and wellness, and relationships. Join us and explore a number of changing perspectives. We're your hosts, Jenni and Josh Brennan. Hey, Jenni.
Hi there.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
So we're here, back again, recording episode 16.
16, that's correct.
Time is flying by.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
Again, just like to start off by saying thank you to everybody for listening. We're getting new listeners all the time. It's so exciting. You just ran a bunch of numbers recently, which was just so mind-boggling. It's exciting to see all those results. Lots of downloads and people sharing, changing perspectives. So it's great. Like us, review us, follow us, all that stuff, so your friends can get a little taste of changing perspectives. So Jenni, episode 16, we're going back to a grief topic.
We are. We're going back to a grief topic, and we're going back to children's grief, and we're talking specifically about children's grief in the classroom.
In the classroom,
and
right.
Both of us, sort of our origin stories, at one point in time, both of us wanted to be teachers when we grew up. That was what we wanted our sort of full-time jobs to be. Clearly, neither of us are doing that.
Although you are a little bit, but not in the children's
right.
setting.
Like I think we both wanted to sort of work in the public school system.
Yes.
But both of our jobs require and entail quite a bit of education.
Yes.
So we are still teachers,
right,
but not kind of what we thought we were going to be. But this is still an area that is important to me. And we have children who are in school. So also it's a topic that, affects us personally as well. So wanted to explore children's grief, since that's what we get a lot of questions about, and specifically do sort of a deep dive into the education component. What's happening in the schools around children's grief? Because really, if you have a child who's school age, that's where they are 5 days a week. 7 hours or so a day, at least, maybe more if they are in an after school program or a before school program. That's where they spend, 9 months out of the year. They spend 180 days a year in that school system. And what I've been hearing anecdotally for many years is that schools don't really know how best to provide support specifically around grief. They try really hard. Funding is obviously an issue for many local public schools. Just being able to fund things like curriculum.
Right.
And so we're seeing a lot of school districts lay off or fire or kind of shift around support staff like social workers, guidance counselors. Those are becoming fewer and fewer.
Right.
And
you have to triage the resources based on what you have. Right.
So anecdotally, what I'd been hearing is, and what we've seen sort of personally, is that there will be a significant loss for a child, a parent, a grandparent, a sibling, and it's not really talked about. It's not explored. It's just this kind of secret, almost like a dirty little secret that then people sort of gossip about. And it just kind of hangs there, not getting addressed. And so what I wanted to do was actually collect some data and collect sort of a poll, kind of like what I did for the funeral services, except for this one, it was actually a more in-depth poll, and I have some data. So I think what we'll do is we'll share.
I wanted to interrupt you because I'm good at that.
Yep.
And say, we teased this a little bit in a few episodes ago. We talked about exploring children's grief, 7 things grieving children need. If you haven't listened to that episode, please, it's not a prerequisite, or this is not like a TV series. You don't have to listen to that first. But if you haven't listened to that one yet, maybe you want to pause this one, listen to that one, and gives you a little bit of foundational knowledge about children's grief. And now we're sort of exploring that, a little bit of a deeper dive, children's grief in the school setting. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Okay. So
thank you for
was the interruption worth it? Is that okay?
No, because I've completely lost my train of thought. So I don't know where I was headed with that. But thank you for for that.
You can always rely on me for derailing you.
That is very true. Yeah. So what I was going to do is sort of go through the data and then go through the 9 tips around how to actually support children's grief in the classroom. So what I did is I put out sort of a call to action via social media and asked folks who were school teachers now, or had been school teachers in the past, sort of pre-K all the way up through grade 12, to fill out a survey, an anonymous survey. And I told people they could share it with other people, and really left it open for about 3 weeks, and had like immediate responses. Like as soon as the poll went live, I was getting notifications that people had completed the survey, which for me could mean a few things. One, people really wanted to help me out, but I don't think that was it. Two, that people really wanted to talk about it. Like, oh my gosh, this is finally someone's asking me about grief in the classroom. And so really overwhelming responses. So I'll walk us through each of the questions and kind of talk about what the answers were and then kind of what that means.
Perfect.
Does that sound good?
Absolutely.
Okay. So the first
I'll
question,
try not to interrupt you and derail you too much.
But you will, I'm sure. The first question asked, what was the grade level taught? Interesting that 100% of the responses were pre-K through 6th grade. So I guess I don't have a lot of friends or colleagues that teach at the high school or beyond middle school level.
Interesting.
So that is interesting. And I'm sorry, I'm kind of froggy and coughing because it's allergy season. I did take some sinus allergy meds and they've helped a little bit. But,
you're struggling a little bit.
It's the time of year where froggy Jenni comes into play.
Yeah.
Hopefully it doesn't impact my asthma.
Didn't you have a preschool student at some point make comments to you had a funny voice?
I think he actually said, you have your frog voice today.
Yeah.
I was Miss Jen back then.
Oh, you were.
I was Miss
Jen.
Right. Miss Jen. Yeah. So this is an important number to kind of keep in mind. That means that these answers are pretty skewed because all of the students that they're talking about are going to be younger students. They're students who are 6th grade or younger. Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's important when we're talking about children's grief in the classroom. When we're looking at these numbers, we're not talking even about middle school really beyond 6th grade.
Right.
We're talking or high school. We're strictly talking children 6th grade and younger. And really the data here is 50% were grades 4 through 6, and then 40% was K through 3, and then the other 10 was pre-K. Mm-hmm. So really, kind of almost half and half, really half and half, kind of young children, and then kind of your late childhood, early adolescence. So half and half split. So keep that in mind as we're moving through, because that definitely informs what this data means. And again, I'm a data junkie. We sort of talked about that a few episodes ago. Like I love this. And I would always say this, and I always say this in my classes, anytime sort of data and statistics come up, we could spend an entire hour just on what the data from that one question meant.
Absolutely. Well, I will say I actually really like data as well. Not math, not the mathy part. Right. The statistics stuff gives me stress headaches. But I love data. I love looking at it, talking about what it means, the trending elements of data. And just to clarify too, you alluded to the fact that you and I always thought we might be teachers, or that was sort of initially what we were playing on, but we actually were preschool teachers.
True. Yeah. Right. And I used to work and I used to work for a middle school kind of enrichment program. And so that required me to teach at the middle school level. And at one point we were down a math teacher, so I had to become a 6th grade math teacher.
That just gives me hives.
Great. No, it was so much fun. I love
about
math. That. But then ultimately I taught, because I'm a social worker, like study skills and stuff like that. Okay. So have you looked at the answers, Josh? You kind of have, I guess.
Yeah.
So I can't ask you to guess. The second question was, the first question.
I've only cursory looked at them. I can flip them over.
Yeah, flip them over. I might ask you.
Perfect.
First question was, what grade level have you taught, sort of primarily? And I indicated, if you've taught at different grade levels, what was the one you've spent most of the bulk of your time at? Mm-hmm. Second question was, how many college level courses specifically on grief have you completed? Remember, we've talked a lot in this podcast about how a lot of folks that intersect with grief on a regular aren't required to take a grief class.
Right.
I never had to take a grief class as a social worker. I never had to take a grief class in my undergraduate degree in psychology with a minor in education. Also a minor in art history, but grief wasn't required.
That sounds like a different episode.
Grief wasn't required for any of that. So how many college level courses specifically on grief have you completed? 90% of the respondents to this poll have taken 0 college level grief courses.
Wow.
And teachers have to have a lot of training. They have to have their bachelor's degree. In many places, they also have to have their master's degree. And in many places, they have to have education beyond that, college education beyond that.
Right.
90% of these teachers who work with children from 6th grade and younger have had 0 courses on grief.
Wow.
10% have had 1.
That's
So
mind-boggling.
100% have had one or less when we're talking about grief classes.
There's a missing element. There's a need there for sure.
Yeah. And when you think about statistics, you think about children, those of you out there, think about your children, think about children that you know. How many children do you know that have ever experienced a loss that might be grieving? Maybe it's a pet. Maybe it's something like an aunt or an uncle or a family friend or a parent or a grandparent or a caregiver. How many of them have ever experienced grief from a loss that's not related to death, a divorce, parents having to move away, family members moving away? Did I say death of a sibling?
I don't think so.
I don't think I did.
But
Lots.
it happens a lot. Like you think about all these different possibilities, loss and grief and death happens a lot, just
Right.
statistically speaking.
Right. So, but we don't build that into our curriculum for teacher training. Okay. How many, so that was college level courses. So then I also wanted to see, okay, how many sort of continuing education, sort of training classes have you had?
Can
so
I
how
guess?
many? Yeah. Well, let me read the question.
Go ahead.
How many continuing education courses and or training specifically on grief have you completed? So this is not college level.
Oh, so I'm going to guess it's extremely minimal. Is it zero? Still?
70% or zero.
70%.
70%. So 20% is one sort of continuing education.
Mm-hmm.
And that could be like a 3-hour training.
Yeah.
And then 10%. So 20% is one and 10% is two.
Wow.
That's it. So we still have 100% with 2 or less kind of trainings on it. Still, the vast majority, 70% with nothing.
Is it 90% one or zero?
Yes.
Is that the numbers?
Yeah. So we have 70% that have taken neither a training or a college level course. 70% of these respondents.
Wow.
20% have taken one training. 10% have taken 2 trainings, not college level courses. Okay. How long have you been working in the field of education? So thinking about these numbers, Josh, thinking that, okay, these are teachers who are teaching 6th grade and younger. 90% have not taken any college courses in grief. 70% have not had any continuing education courses in grief. How long would you think the bulk of these teachers have been working in the field?
Oh, on average.
No, like what category would be the highest?
Oh, like 20 years.
Yeah, 50% of them have been in the field for 15 to 20 years.
Wow.
So working in the field for 15 to 20 years, but with those statistics of very, very few trainings.
Never having
on grief.
had any trainings on grief.
30% were 10 to 15 years. So that means that 80% of these respondents have been in the field for 10 to 20 years. So they're not newbies to the field.
Right. So this, a lot of things pop into my head about they're sort of just winging it for 15 years.
Yeah.
Just winging it.
On their own. Like that's a tremendous amount of pressure. And so when we get to the end of this, I have a lot of sort of free form answers.
Responses.
Yeah.
But then I can, I'm just guessing, or my imagination sort of on fire right now, thinking about the fact that you have probably parents that would be upset with the teacher if it wasn't handled correctly, right? They might get some flack, some grief for not handling it correctly, and they've never had training.
Right. So one of the responses that I got was a voicemail was a very heated response. And this was something that had happened probably, thinking about the fact that I know this person probably 10 to 15 years ago. So not something that had happened recently.
Right.
And this individual was very upset about the way the school had responded following the death of a child in their school system. And yes, so to your point, like here's a parent who's extremely upset about how a school responded to a death, but the school itself was kind of just winging it, it sounded like.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what's happening a lot of the time.
So on top of all these other things that teachers have to deal with, right? They're going in blind, having to deal with students in their classroom who are grieving a loss with zero training, at the risk,
very, very minimal training,
and at the risk of upsetting the student and their family.
Yeah, and potentially doing some damage.
Yes.
Actually, here's a piece missing. There was 10% have been in the field for more than 20 years. So really 90% of these respondents have been in the field for 10 to more than 20 years.
Wow.
And have had very, very little training, specifically in children's grief. So then I asked, how many of you have had in your time have had the experience of having at least one child or a student. Oh, I have a typo. I'm so sorry for those of you that did this, that there's a typo. 2 typos.
I think they forgive you. It's
I hope so. That you've at some point in your career had a child or a student who lost either a close family member during the school year or a close family member at some point prior to you having them.
That's got to be a lot.
It's a lot. So, let's see. These are all percentages here. I'm seeing if there was, so more than half of them have said yes, that they lost a child. No, they didn't lose a child. They had a student who lost a close family member during the school year. So more than half said yes. And then for the question about at some point before coming to them, let me think of a way to sort of look at this, to present this. 100% of them had at least one student at some point.
That's what I was thinking.
Who had a loss prior to coming to them. And if you remember previously on our previous episodes, previously seen on the Changing Perspectives podcast, children grieve in spurts. And so, and they re-grieve sort of as they're entering new developmental stages, their prior losses come back and they re-grieve them over again. So just because a student may have lost their father in 2nd grade and you have them in 6th grade, you still need to know how to respond to a grieving child, because it can look like that child is experiencing that loss for the same time, because they're experiencing that loss for the first time as a 6th grader, kind of going, maybe they're starting middle school for the first time. So they're starting middle school without a father who's alive and living with them.
You have to be in tune to certain activities or events that are happening in the schools that involve parents.
Yes.
Like a parent day or
a grandparent day.
Right. Or when people, the parents come and do reading during like the Dr. Seuss birthday week or whatever. What if the child doesn't have a parent that comes to read?
And I think anecdotally, we've seen that change just in our own children's school districts, because we've had public education. We lived in a different district before. So we've had
So we've had experience.
We've had experience in 2 different public school districts. But we've seen some of that change. It's not like Grandparents' Day anymore. It was like Special Person Day, things like that. But absolutely, these things come up. So 100%. You know what I'm realizing? I didn't ask if any of them had ever lost a student. My little fumble over words made me realize that is a possibility, because children die.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking anecdotally, our children haven't experienced that in their schools with their peer group. I did in high school.
You did?
A few. Yeah. I don't remember if you did or not.
I don't think so.
No, but so that would have been an interesting question to ask, and I didn't. So I apologize for leaving that out. So then, those were sort of quantitative questions, sort of numbers. Then I wanted to ask qualitative questions, sort of about feelings, because that's what I do. How confident are you in your ability to provide support to grieving children in your classroom? No. Oh, and so the choices here are not confident at all, somewhat, slightly, quite, or extremely.
Okay.
So really kind of like 1 to 5.
Right.
Any guesses what it might be?
Well, based on the fact that they're missing training, I would say that there's probably a lot that aren't confident.
Yeah, nobody was quite or extremely confident. Not a single one of those teachers felt like they felt confident in their abilities. Nobody ranked, if this was on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the most, nobody picked 4 or 5.
Right.
The vast majority of them picked 3. 70% of them picked 3, kind of in the middle. Like, I kind of know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
10% said not confident at all. And so I feel really badly for those teachers that are in this classroom filled with students who are at some point going to suffer a loss or have already suffered a loss.
Right.
And they don't feel confident at all in their ability to support that child around their grief, or the other children in the classroom around that grief.
Yeah.
And then 20% were somewhat confident.
That's a big element here. is how
especially as the kids
peer
get
group
older
is responding
Yep.
to the loss.
Yes.
Or their fellow student who's grieving.
So the next question was, how confident are you in your school district's ability to provide support to grieving children? Okay, so I asked them to look at how confident do you feel in your ability, kind of one-on-one supporting children's grief. And then I asked, what about the school district? Because maybe you don't feel so confident, but maybe you feel confident in the district, your administrative staff, your support staff, your social emotional staff. Maybe you feel more supportive, confident in them. So what would you guess? Same sort of scale.
I feel like that could go either way. So if you've got counselors and school counselors, school psychologists or whatnot on staff, you probably feel a little bit more confident in your district than you do in yourself. But I don't really know. I can't venture a guess.
Nobody was extremely confident.
Okay.
So nobody came at this saying, okay, for sure, my district has this. They're going to figure it out.
Right.
Nobody felt that way.
Wow.
The vast majority were the same. They were at that slightly level, that kind of middle of the road, like a number 3. And then it was 20% for the other 3 categories. So sort of 1, 2, and 4. So 20% were not at all, 20% were somewhat, 20% were quite, but nobody felt extremely confident. So both teachers who completed this survey, and again, we can't apply this to every teacher out there. We can't really extrapolate this data and say, okay, this is the state of our sort of education system.
Right.
No, this is a snapshot. These are people who kind of were connected to me, or were connected to people that I know, people who saw the survey and who wanted to complete it, and had the means to complete it. So this is not clean data. But it's interesting, and it does kind of inform and kind of guide a discussion.
Do you have how many respondents there were?
I would have to go and get that for you.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And my other question, this was your survey, right?
Oh yeah. I created this.
You created a survey.
So this is really, this is not, I'm not going to be writing a journal article about this or anything like that. It's just really meant to sort of guide discussion.
Yeah.
So
but you could take this to the next level, Jenni.
I'd have to redo this survey. So
I know there's a lot of work, but there's such a need here. I mean, this is sort of the first level of like training content development, right? To figure out, okay, you've got this need where these teachers need to get this training, this education, and to figure out how you develop that. This is needs assessment, what you're doing now. So this is like the first step.
It is the first step. So I wanted to share the sort of open-ended responses. Yeah. So I asked essentially, in your opinion, what types of support do grieving children need in the classroom? And what do you, as the teachers, need in order to provide support to grieving children? So here are just some of what they wrote. Children need to know that they are safe and loved, and I need to know what to say. So they're right. Children do need to know that they're safe and loved. They need to feel validated. So that teacher totally gets what they need, but this teacher also doesn't quite know what to say to communicate that. But the intent is spot on. So this was an anonymous survey. I'm not quite sure who said that, but you get a sticker.
I can take the next one because I actually have it in front of me.
Okay.
So the children need someone they are comfortable talking to, an outlet to express themselves, journal and other tools, the ability to leave or a safe space away from others, support for the other students in the class to help them help their classmates.
Yes, perfect. That's exactly what, so that sums it all up. So we can wrap up our podcast episode now.
Yeah, right.
No, I mean, essentially, yes, this is a teacher who gets it.
We can just shut it up.
And so maybe they're one of the teachers that rated themselves a little bit higher in confidence, or maybe not. So there could be teachers out here who are not feeling confident, but know exactly what to do.
They could have answered that question too, with regards to resources, right? Confident you are in your ability to provide support to grieving children in your classroom. That could be, I don't have time. I don't have the space. I don't have.
True. That's a great point.
I
know what to do, but I can't do it because I'm managing 24 other kids and trying to get them prepared for the statewide testing. Yes, absolutely. That's true. Do you want to keep reading them? Because it helps my voice.
Oh yeah. The froggy voice. Yeah. Children need resources, support groups, staff that is trained to understand what they're going through. Yeah, absolutely. Not just 1 or 2 counselors who may or may not be available. And the teacher says that they need more professional development in this area for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely agree with both of this. And I love this point about not just one or two counselors who may or may not be available.
Yeah.
Really important. There are many districts that don't have a guidance counselor or a social worker on staff full time in a school. And as kids get older, it can also become very it can be hard for children, especially teenagers, to go see the counselor.
Right.
Unless the counselor has worked really hard to establish connections kind of with everybody. So that it's not like, ooh, you went to go see the counselor. Where did he go?
Yeah.
Oh, he's in the counselor's office.
So can I ask a question about those guys for just a second, those professions? Because we've talked about how you individually as a clinical social worker didn't get grief specific training in your
right. And I don't know if
program.
you remember, but when we lived in Colorado and I graduated with my master's degree, I became certified as a school counselor.
Yes, that's right.
For Colorado. So but then we moved right after I got the certification. But I could have become a school social worker.
And this was
in the school system doing this work without any single grief training.
3 years after Columbine?
For sure. Yeah. We lived right near where Columbine happened. So yes. So even in a state that had one of the first mass school shootings sort of in the modern era, they still hadn't made any requirements that school social workers at that time be trained in grief.
So that's my point. So this teacher makes the point, just one or two counselors who may or may not be available.
And also they may or may not have any grief training.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a really good point. True.
The next one says children need smaller class sizes. This is the best way to ensure that teachers have the opportunity to really get to know and support all of their students. That's a really great point.
It's a really great point.
Grief support training is also something that is not nearly as accessible to us, but is imperative. Right.
And in my practice, it's kind of a funny thing that happens. I have a lot of patients that are school teachers, and I don't market I always say, like, I don't
attract them.
I don't go to schools and put my business card. I don't. But I think there's something probably about my nature and sort of my profile and what I specialize in that is attractive to, I don't mean physically attractive, but that draws teachers. And so I have a lot of teachers who talk to me a lot about how they have to go through all these mandatory trainings and they're required to get training in all sorts of different things. And they don't always have really a choice about what those topics are. And so I think I'm hearing what this teacher is saying, that, they need training that's accessible to them, that's kind of offered and is supported by their district. There was something else. Oh, the smaller class sizes, sort of to your point that maybe the teachers are answering, I'm not really confident in my ability to support them, not because they don't know how, but because they kind of can't logistically. Right. For so many students, for some students, for some children, for a lot of them, they're not going to walk up to the teacher and say, I'm really sad today because my brother died last year and it's the anniversary of his death and I'm really sad. They're probably not going to do that. And the parents might not be able to give the teacher a heads up about that. And so if the teacher doesn't know that student really well, they're probably not going to pick up on the signs that something's happening. They might just see sort of a little bit of regressed behavior, some acting out, things like that. And so this is a really great point they make about sort of the benefits of smaller class sizes. Mm-hmm. It allows for that social emotional content and development and relationship building there.
The next one says in-school counseling. Age-appropriate books, professional development in this area. Right.
Yeah. That in-school counseling piece, I think is important because it's really hard. I don't see children anymore in my practice. It just is not kind of where my focus is right now. Right. Maybe when I don't have children that are young anymore, I will kind of go back to doing that clinically. But I get a lot of people that reach out to me, probably 5 to 10 a week, looking for a counselor for their child. And it has cut down a little bit because I kind of take off the children's experience on my sort of advertising areas. But still I have people saying, please, can I get on a wait list for you? When are you going to work with them again? Yeah. Not because I'm great, but because they're desperate, because it is so hard to find therapists, counselors that work with children, that take insurance, that are willing to do that. And so it's not easy if a school says to a family, I think your child could benefit from some counseling. Good luck.
Easier said than
Try
done.
to find someone.
Right.
It's really difficult. And so there's a huge benefit to having some counseling staff that's good counseling staff available to children in the school system, in a school setting during their regular course of their school day.
All right. So the next one, a space to grieve. Books available to help them. That's the second person to mention books.
Right.
Help them talk about a person they feel connected to. You've mentioned children's grief books before.
I have, and I've mentioned that was always one of my favorite days when I was teaching the intro to grief class. Is I would just go to the local library, pull a bunch of books, whatever they had in stock on grief, and bring them in and have the students kind of read them, sort of like preschool story hour, and then reflect on them. And some of them are great and some of them are not so great.
Right.
And we always would talk about, do you think these books should be in classrooms? Like, should they just be in classrooms when kids get up to go do free reading? Should there be books on someone's dog that died or someone who's grieving the loss of a mother? And the answers are always kind of split. And the answer in this family, our family, is split too, because our oldest has always been like, no, I don't want to see that stuff. It shouldn't be around. And our youngest is like, yeah, there should be books on everything in school. Maybe a compromise is to have those books available, not in the regular classroom. And I do think, unfortunately, and people are going to disagree with me, but I feel like it should be in every classroom.
I agree.
And I think some parents would say, but Jenni, I'm not ready for my kids to know about that stuff. I'm not ready for my kids to know that a parent could die or that a sibling could die. I get that. But it could happen.
Yeah.
And your kid needs to be prepared for it to happen.
Right.
As prepared as they can be, and needs to be aware that it could happen to people in their life, as
Absolutely.
well. So I would argue that it should be in a classroom. However, the support staff, the teachers, should be able to then respond appropriately and have conversations around it.
Right.
And if you don't have that capability, then those books shouldn't be in the classroom.
Right.
But could be in the guidance counselor's office.
Right. Library.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Schools
The
still
actual
have
library.
The next teacher says, my instincts tell me they would need space and grace to move through the grief, but I really don't know, so I would need a trainee to tell me what a child really needs.
Yeah, so here's another teacher that gets it. Our teachers are so amazing.
Yeah.
They just
insightful.
Insightful, and I think teachers get a really bad reputation out there and catch a lot of slack. But what we're seeing is that these teachers, even though they've had zero training, they get it.
Yeah.
They get it sort of instinctually what kids need.
Right.
There's not one single response so far that I disagree with. There's nothing that's wrong with any of this. So even though they haven't had training, they're right, but they're not confident in it. And so imagine what they could do if they had confidence, if they had some training that just said, you're doing it right.
Speaking of that, the next teacher said training to effectively help students through grief.
Yeah. So there's a theme here, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
The next teacher said the needs vary greatly on the student and the loss. This person seems to know a little bit about loss. A loss of a non-custodial parent they saw twice a year, or the custodial grandparent that raised them since birth, can have different effects and needs for the student. Kids that lose a pet can also be grief-stricken, of course. We have great school psychologists and counselors. We often have social work interns that help as well. It also makes a difference if the student receives outside counseling and how the family deals with the loss.
Yes. If I was grading this, you would get A+.
Yeah. Good one.
Excellent points. Yeah. You spot on there. So I would be curious to know, actually, I could go back and see this. I wonder if this individual is one of the individuals that has had a training class on that. So I can't see who the answer is from, but I can link these comments to.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So maybe I will try to do that as we're moving through. I'll try to multitask and see, because I would guess that this individual has had some training in grief and loss.
Yeah, you can see the responses.
I can see the entire response for that one individual.
Not the name.
Right. And then there's then I left it open, sort of not a specific question, but just other comments from folks. So this one, do you know what that means, Josh?
Professional development.
Yeah. Okay.
So more professional development opportunities for teachers around this concept would be excellent. That's a common theme. A lot of folks have said that. This next teacher said, I've had trauma training, which loss falls under, but not training specific to grief.
Right.
And I wondered about that because of all the potential school shootings and violence and all the...
So, and think about, I should have also asked on this, have you undergone training on what to do if there's a school shooting? Like how to respond? Like, wearing the masks, barricading your door, all of that stuff. And I'm going to guess that probably 100% of them have had some level of training in that. So they know they've been trained specifically on what to do if something really awful like that happens, but still have not been trained on what to happen if something that's more likely to happen.
Yes, I was just going to say that. Loss, death, grief happens all the time.
Absolutely.
Thank God. Violence in the schools is rare.
Right.
Still.
Real. And so I completely support teachers being trained in
100%.
that. But there's kind of where our priorities are, right?
The next teacher said, I typically don't address it with the whole class. The school psychologist may if it is a parent. I do have a couple of picture books that deal with loss. That's great. That I have shared with the class or the individual student.
Yeah, and we'll talk as we're kind of going through tips around this piece about addressing it with the whole class. We can talk more about that, but it is, something to think about and to talk about a little bit more. Right.
And this last one, this teacher speaks about grief with students on the autism spectrum. That's a whole different...
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So if we look at grief, children's grief as sort of like an umbrella topic, there's a whole host of sort of subtopics that can fall under that. We can look at specific types of loss. We can look at specific ages of the children. We can look at specific diagnoses that the child might have or needs that the child might have, like being on the autism spectrum. And all of the sort of this is why you can get a degree in sort of grief counseling, or you can take a whole college course on grief, is because there's so much to it.
Right.
Yeah.
So, Jenni, you had shared with me some stats.
That's true.
Okay. So, do you want me to go through these?
Yeah, why don't you read them and we'll talk about them.
Okay. So, the first one is 1 in 5 children will experience the loss of someone close to them before the age of 18.
Yeah. I actually think that seems like it's a little low.
Really?
That's kind of a broad category there, someone close to them, but 1 in 5 is still 20%. So as we're talking about grief in the classroom, that would mean that for teachers, 20% of their children, at any given point in time, will lose someone close to them at some point before they turn 18.
Right.
So just, I pulled the stats together to kind of give us some more numbers because I like the numbers and kind of paint the picture a little bit more about why it's important to talk about grief in the classroom.
Okay. Well, I agree. I mean, I think that really did seem a little low.
A little low.
Yeah. All right. So stat number 2.
Yes.
1 out of every 3 youth in classrooms across America are experiencing a significant loss of some kind.
Right. So there's, again, kind of a broad term. And this is one of the things about statistics and data is that we can really classify things infinitely. So here's another way that folks are looking at grief. So 1 in 3 at any given time are grieving. What was the wording there?
Experiencing a significant loss of some kind.
Experiencing a significant loss of some kind. And so this does not necessarily mean that it's a death-related loss. This could be a loss like a divorce,
right,
or their best friend has moved away, or they have to move out of their home or something like that.
That's a pretty big number, 1 in 3.
Yeah. I mean, I guess anecdotally, think about like your experience as a child going through school, your experiences as a teacher, your experience as a parent now, knowing our children as they go through school, and then kind of, friends, children, things like that. How many times can you, and I'm not kind of asking you to go into detail here or share any of it, but I'm sure you can think of kind of lots of times like, oh yeah, there was a kid or myself or my kid or my kid's friend who was dealing with a loss at some point in time. Right.
Well, you've got these other factors in a child's life that may affect them. A significant experience, significant loss, or maybe it's a significant injury or something. that affects their ability to participate in their favorite sport. And so that's
like not be able to play baseball and throw a ball for over a year.
It sounds like we're speaking from experience.
Yes.
But, teachers have to deal with the fact that something like that might affect the students' affect, their attitude.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you tied it there, because I wasn't thinking about that personally either. But when we think about grief, you grieve when you lose anything that you're attached to. And so you can be attached not just to people, but to things. And you can also be attached to homes, attached to lifestyles, attached to pieces of your identity, attached to your ability to play a particular sport, things like that. And so grief is going to look very similar, for someone who's having a loss of a family member, a loss of someone close to them, and someone who's grieving the loss of something important to them. So when we look at that stat, that 1 in 3, that I really wholeheartedly believe that statistic. I think that's probably a pretty clean stat there, that at any given point in time, 1 out of 3 children in a classroom are going to be experiencing some sort of loss. And the teacher may or may not be aware of that loss. This may be something that the parents have talked to the teacher about, or that maybe the child sort of blurts out in like morning meeting or circle time or something, or on the playground at recess, or doesn't share at all. And the only kind of hint might be some changes in behavior. So something to kind of keep in mind, that teachers are with children all of the time, and children are experiencing loss pretty frequently.
Right. Well, and it's a pretty subjective statement, right? Even the term significant is pretty subjective, but I think that is obviously relative to
what's significant to me might not be significant to you. At some point in the future, we will do an episode sort of about what we call mediators of mourning, which helps to explain why there can be such vast differences in how people experience their grief. And
a little teaser,
yeah.
Okay.
Stay tuned.
All right. So stat number 3, it is estimated that 73,000 children die every year in the United States. Of those children, 83% have surviving siblings.
Right. So children die. Unfortunately, we've experienced that personally. We've experienced that professionally. Sometimes those children, when they die, are children who are attending school and who are students in classrooms with teachers and peers. And quite often, 83% of the time, those children that die have siblings. And those siblings may be children who are in a school system, who are in a classroom.
Right.
And if they're not, at some point they will be. Right? Even if they're homeschooled, at some point they will be socially around other children. And because children grieve in spurts and re-grieve, that grief over losing a sibling to death probably will resurface at some point in time. Again, may show itself in a classroom setting with a teacher.
So it's helpful to know that even if the death or loss didn't happen during the school year that the child is in your classroom, they're coming in with this loss. It's
Absolutely.
Part of them.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just because, I mean, I do think that there are people out there that think, if a child dies, but before another sibling is born, or when that sibling is really young and they don't really remember them, then that doesn't really have an impact on that child's life, the surviving sibling's life. Yeah. But in fact, it does. And I guess, spoiler alert, teaser alert, that is also on our list of topics at some point, is to really talk about the impact of sibling loss, both prior to and after. A sibling that kind of dies before you're even born, or a sibling that dies after you yourself are born.
Right.
So it can still show up and have an impact on that child's functioning in a classroom.
Right. Okay. The next stat, 1.5 million children are living in a single parent household because of the death of one parent.
Right. That's pretty significant, right?
That's very significant.
Right. So, I think a lot of teachers now at the beginning of the school year, although not, I guess now that we're in middle school territory, that doesn't really happen there. But I was going to say at the beginning of the year, the teachers kind of send home a little note like, tell me about your family, who lives in your home. What else should I know? Are there things I should know? And I don't think that we really did that for middle school now that I'm thinking about it. So I don't know. I don't know that that's something that every family would share openly at the beginning of the year.
Right,
Like, I don't know that they may or may not. My point is the teachers may or may not know what's going on with regards to the family's loss history.
Right. And there's always a million family units, different types of family units that teachers need to be aware of. And some of those family units the dynamics might exist because of a parent loss. And it's important to understand that.
Absolutely.
All right. The next one, it says 1 out of every 20 children aged 15 and younger will suffer the loss of one or both parents. These statistics don't account for the number of children who lose a parental figure, such as a grandparent or other relative that provides care. I was actually just going to bring that up because that's very true. There's so many parental figures in a child's life, or potential parental figures in a child's life.
Right. I think so many children are not necessarily raised by their grandparents, but certainly have in today's age, where for so many families, both parents work, or at least have to work kind of partially. If you're in a 2-parent household, or you're in a child's in sort of a single parent home, or parents are divorced, or not together. Oftentimes there is a lot of assistance, childcare assistance that goes on from grandparents. And I think we've seen that sort of anecdotally, in the classroom. We've seen that sort of on the sports fields. There are grandparents that are very heavily involved and become parental figures. And just statistically speaking, those individuals tend to die before parents. Yep. And so there are quite a number of children who lose significant parental figures or caregivers at some point during their childhood.
Right. And it's important, I think, to remember that you never really know the impact of a loss in a child's life. It's just because, the relationship, we can assume the relationship is stronger or more significant for a parent loss, but we really can't assume anything, right? We can't assume that it's less of a loss.
Like, it's just an aunt or something like that, or aunt for those of you who are not in the Northeast.
Yeah, we said aunt.
We said aunt.
There is a U in that word.
I know. Yes.
But yeah, I guess that's my point.
Yeah.
We never really know what the relationship is.
Yeah. So the point here, I think that was the last stat, right?
That was the last one.
The point with just pulling in some of the statistics here was just to add some more numbers here. And so to sort of take us out of that one particular survey that I put forth looking for information about teachers' experiences with grief in the classroom. These are sort of national statistics about grief, children's grief experiences and their experiences with loss. I did want to add a piece of information. I was able to multitask and go back in and remember that great quote from a teacher. And I was like, I bet this teacher is someone who took is probably one of those ones that took a grief course. And I said I could go back through and look. Yeah. No grief courses at all. Yeah. That teacher is just kind of naturally, or perhaps from their other education training, they are just kind of naturally inclined to know what grieving children need. So my assumption was wrong. Just wanted to point that out.
So did you say you were wrong?
I did. No, I said my assumption was wrong. Right. Just a little different.
Fair enough.
Fair enough, right? So we are doing something a little bit different with this episode. I know.
Tell everybody.
I don't quite know how I feel about it.
We have to.
Well, we have decided.
almost 50 something minutes, I think.
We decided as we were exploring this topic that this topic is probably too big to do in one episode. So what we've decided to do,
two-parter.
It is our first two-parter. You just told me to tell everybody what we're doing, and you just delivered the punchline. So,
I let the cat right out of the bag.
Right. So this is part one, where we kind of have looked at the data, the numbers, kind of the why and the what, what's sort of the experience of teachers with regards to children's grief in the classroom, and why is that their experience?
Mm-hmm.
So what are the numbers saying about, what kinds of grief children are experiencing in the classroom? So hopefully we've sort of encapsulated that for you in this part one. And then in part two, which we'll release on Thursday, we will release, we will share with you in the podcast the specifics about kind of the how. So what are the specific tips about how to provide support for children's grief in the classroom? So part one is the kind of background information.
Right.
Part two, coming out in just a few days, will be okay, now what? Now what? So now, Jenni and Josh, you've told us what teachers are thinking about, or at least, the teachers that completed your survey, what they're thinking about with regards to their ability to support children's grief in the classroom, their district's ability to do that, their experiences with children's grief in the classroom. You've told us kind of about loss for children, sort of nationally. Now what? So what do we do with that information? Right. And I think the what do we do with that information is pretty big. And so I want to make sure that we're giving that enough time, and also respecting that for most people, podcasts that, are something they try to digest in around an hour, under an hour. So hopefully this is okay. You guys can give us some feedback. Like, would you have rather we did this as just one super long episode? Like, I don't know, what do they call it in TV? If you have like a super long episode, is there a term for that, Mr. Entertainment?
I don't know.
Okay.
Maybe on a special episode.
Like special hour-long episode.
But I don't think we've ever actually said that, a little behind the curtain kind of thing. We try to keep episodes about an hour or so. But yeah, we definitely, as we were going through, thought that this one wasn't going to just be an hour. We're at an hour now. So.
Right. So that's it. So we're kind of ending with like a cliffhanger. A cliffhanger.
The first Changing Perspectives two-parter, and the first Changing Perspectives cliffhanger.
Right. So join us on Thursday, where we will talk about now what? How do we actually support children's grief in the classroom? And in the meantime, if you're listening to this on Monday and you've got a few days until Thursday, go ahead and dialogue with us over on Instagram about your thoughts, about any specific questions that you have. And we can, make sure that if we're not addressing those in the actual episode on Thursday, we are addressing them for you on Instagram. And
actually, just as a little, teaser out there, we won't be finished recording part two until after part one is released. So dialogue with us, and we'll try to get your thoughts on the air.
That's a true story. Yeah. Yes.
Before we end this one, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to a great podcast that we had the pleasure. Did you want to say anything else before I jumped into the different topic?
No, I think that was okay.
Okay, cool. We had the amazing opportunity and great pleasure to be guests for the first time on someone else's podcast, which was really, really exciting, in response to our sort of pop culture take on death, mostly in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We had a chance to be on the Pop Culture Cosmos, which was a lot of fun. That episode was released last Friday, I believe. It was yesterday.
Yeah,
May 10th.
Our Saturday has been so long that yesterday seems literally a week ago.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it was released. We recorded it earlier in the week. It was released yesterday. So check that out. Pop Culture Cosmos, or the PCC Multiverse, a great entertainment group focused on pop culture, movies, TVs, gaming. The host, Gerald, is such a great guy. Apple Podcasts, they're on Instagram, Facebook.
They're literally everywhere. Yes. So there's a link on our Instagram page to all of their locations.
Yes. So that's Pop Culture Cosmos. Anything else for this first parter?
Part one.
part one?
Nope.
Okay, cool. So this is going to do it for part one. Thank you guys so very much for listening. Please stay tuned for part two on children's grief in the classroom. And just as a quick reminder, this episode was for education and entertainment purposes only. Should you need additional support, please contact your healthcare provider for information and referrals. Please follow us on Facebook at Changing Perspectives Podcast and on Instagram at Changing Perspectives Blog. Go ahead and check out the Pop Culture Cosmos as well. You can check out our website by going to changingperspectivesblog.com or send us an email to changingpodcast@gmail.com. Go ahead and subscribe to the show so you'll never miss an episode, and we will see you next time. Say bye, Jenni.
Bye, Jenni.
Welcome to Cinemarks. If you have your tickets, take your seats. The show is about to begin.
Ever dance for the devil in the pale moonlight?
Every week, Troy Adams is joined by an array of nerdy podcasting co-hosts.
Hey, Mom! The meatloaf!
They discuss films and television from the past, present, and future. It's always something different on the slate.
Life is a box of chocolates almost. You never know what you're gonna get.
It's always kept fun, spirited, and they attempt to be entertaining.
60% of the time, it works. Every time.
You can follow the Cinemarks on Twitter and Instagram at CinemarksPod.
Go ahead. Make my day.
The Cinemarks podcast is available on Wooshkaa, iTunes, Spotify, and most other podcasting platforms. We hope you enjoy the show.
Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
The Changing Perspectives podcast is produced, recorded, and edited by Dizzybird Studios, Whitman, Massachusetts. Visit Dizzybird Studios on Facebook, facebook.com/DizzyBirdStudios.